He is 4 feet, 10 inches tall. He has been called the King of Short Kings, a walking punchline turned Hollywood royalty, a man who has made more people laugh than almost anyone alive. But behind the wisecracks and the wild characters, behind Louis De Palma's snarl and Frank Reynolds' chaos, there is a much quieter story. It is a story about a boy from the Jersey Shore who was never supposed to make it, a body that has fought him every single day of his life, and a marriage that never technically ended, even though the two people in it stopped living together years ago. Danny DeVito just turned 80. He is still working, still funny, still instantly recognizable anywhere in the world. But how he actually lives now, quietly, away from the cameras, is not the fairy tale most people imagine. Daniel Michael DeVito Jr. was born on November 17, 1944, at Raleigh-Fitkin-Paul Morgan Memorial Hospital in Neptune Township, New Jersey. His parents, Daniel Sr. and Julia, were Italian-American, their roots tracing back to a small town in the Basilicata region of southern Italy. Danny was the youngest of the family and the only boy, arriving after 2 older sisters. His father ran a string of small businesses over the years, at different times a dry cleaner, a luncheonette, a dairy outlet, a diner, a pool hall, always working, never rich. His mother stayed home. It was an ordinary, hard-working, immigrant household in Asbury Park, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and where a family's name carried weight even without much money behind it. What set Danny apart almost from birth was something nobody could see with the naked eye until he grew older, a rare genetic disorder called multiple epiphyseal dysplasia, more commonly known as Fairbanks disease. It affects how cartilage develops at the ends of long bones, and it meant that DeVito's bones simply stopped lengthening earlier than they should have. He ended up with a normal-sized head and torso, but arms and legs that never caught up. By adulthood, he stood at 4 feet 10 inches, a stature that would define how the world saw him for the rest of his life, whether he wanted it to or not. His mother, Julia, was already 40 years old and raising 2 teenage daughters when Danny arrived, and by her own later admission, his arrival wasn't something she had planned for or particularly wanted. Decades afterward, in a 2015 interview, she put it plainly. She hadn't wanted another child, but she had become deeply proud of the one she got. It's the kind of honesty that could easily wound a person, and it's not hard to imagine a younger Danny absorbing that complicated welcome into the world in his own way, even if the family around him was, by most accounts, a loving and tightly bonded one. His father added his own kind of complexity to the household. Daniel Sr. was, by DeVito's own description, a sweet, hard-working man during the day, someone who ran a rotating cast of small businesses to keep the family afloat. But he also struggled with alcohol, and drinking brought out a different person entirely. DeVito has spoken about this directly, describing his father as someone who could be gentle in daylight and volatile once he had been drinking. It wasn't the stuff of tabloid melodrama. It was the ordinary, exhausting reality that a lot of working-class families of that era quietly lived with and rarely discussed outside the house. Fairbanks disease is not simply about height. It carries a lifetime of joint stress, particularly in the hips, knees, and ankles, and it tends to bring on arthritis far earlier than usual. For most people who live with the condition, chronic aching in the joints becomes a fact of daily life by middle age. DeVito has rarely dwelled on the medical details in public. He has never turned his condition into a sympathy story or leaned on it as an excuse. Instead, he built an entire career on refusing to let his body dictate the shape of his ambitions. As a boy, that wasn't always easy. He has talked about being an easy target for bullies because of his size, about the sting of trying to slow dance with girls he liked, and worrying his face would end up in an accidentally suggestive place simply because of how short he was. He has joked that being unable to slow dance forced him to become a genuinely excellent dancer instead, since he had no choice but to move. But underneath the humor, there was a boy constantly aware that his body made him different in a world that rewards sameness. Growing up in a tight-knit Jersey neighborhood softened some of that. He has said that in Asbury Park, having your own posse, your own crew of neighborhood friends, meant nobody could bully you for long. Still, being physically different from everyone around him, in a decade, that had little patience for physical difference, left a mark that never fully faded. At 14, Danny asked his parents to send him away to boarding school. Asbury Park in the 1950s was starting to change, and not for the better. Some of the kids he grew up with were drifting toward petty crime and worse. Danny, sensing the drift, asked to be removed from it before it could pull him under. His parents agreed, and he was enrolled at Oratory Preparatory School in Summit, New Jersey, where he graduated in 1962. For a while, he even thought about the priesthood, an idea that dissolved almost the moment adolescence fully arrived, and his interest in girls made the calling feel, in his own words, entirely implausible. There was no dramatic plan to become a movie star. DeVito had no real interest in college, and instead drifted into work at his older sister Angela's beauty salon, training as a cosmetologist. It's a detail that still surprises people decades later. Before he was one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, DeVito spent roughly a year and a half doing hair. He has told the story of styling a deceased client for her funeral at her family's request and briefly taking on part-time work as a morgue cosmetologist, arranging the hair of the dead. It is a strange, almost gothic footnote to a career that would later be full of dark comedy, and it is entirely true. The version of Danny DeVito that exists in the public imagination, the actor, the director, the producer, almost didn't happen at all. He didn't set out to perform. He applied to New York's American Academy of Dramatic Arts because he wanted formal training as a makeup artist, hoping it would make him better at his job at the salon. Admission required every applicant, regardless of program, to perform a monologue. DeVito, who had never acted a day in his life, did one anyway. Something in that audition changed the direction of everything that came after. He didn't just get into the makeup program. He discovered he loved being on a stage, and he pivoted into acting classes almost by accident. He graduated in 1966. After school, he worked at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center in Waterford, Connecticut, where he met a young actor named Michael Douglas, the beginning of one of the most important friendships and professional partnerships of his life. DeVito eventually drifted out to Los Angeles chasing an audition for a film version of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. He didn't get the part. He didn't get much of anything for a while. He worked as a car parker on the Sunset Strip, blending in with the counterculture crowd in long hair and sneakers, still chasing a career that showed no signs of wanting him. DeVito moved back to New York and started landing small parts off-Broadway, appearing in productions like Shoot Anything with Hair That Moves and The Man with the Flower in His Mouth in 1969. In 1971, he was cast as Martini in an off-Broadway production of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, adapted from Ken Kesey's novel. It wasn't a lead role, and it wasn't going to make him famous on its own. But 4 years later, when Michael Douglas produced the film adaptation, he remembered his old friend and offered him the chance to reprise the role on screen. To prepare, DeVito spent time observing patients at a real facility on New York's Ward's Island, quietly absorbing details he could bring into the character that weren't on the page. He built physical habits into the performance that came directly from that research. Small, specific choices meant to honor the people he had watched rather than simply play a type. The film swept the 5 major Academy Awards in 1976: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. DeVito wasn't nominated for anything himself, but he was, for the first time in his life, visible. Visible to casting directors. Visible to an industry that had spent years telling him, without ever saying it outright, that there wasn't a place for someone who looked like him. That kind of visibility doesn't pay the bills by itself, though. DeVito continued to face rejection after rejection through the late 1960s and much of the 1970s. Auditions came and went. Casting directors were often blunt about the fact that his height made him a hard sell for conventional leading roles. He kept working odd jobs to survive while chasing parts that rarely materialized, including as stretch parking cars on the Sunset Strip. During part of this period, he was rooming with Michael Douglas in New York, two broke and proven actors betting everything on a business that owed them nothing. Douglas would go on to land roles faster than DeVito did, but the friendship held, and it eventually became one of the most consequential professional relationships of DeVito's life. Douglas produced One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and years later produced Romancing the Stone, pulling his old roommate along into stardom almost as a package deal. It was a long, unglamorous grind before any of that paid off, the kind of thing that rarely makes it into highlight reels, but it shaped him. He has said many times that he never skipped an audition just because he didn't physically resemble the character on the page, and that stubbornness eventually became his greatest professional asset. Everything changed with Taxi. In 1978, DeVito was cast as Louis De Palma, the tyrannical, foul-mouthed dispatcher at the fictional Sunshine Cab Company. Louis was mean. Louis was petty. Louis was, by any conventional measure, deeply unlikable, and audiences adored him anyway. DeVito won a Golden Globe for the role in 1980 and an Emmy the following year, a stunning outcome for a supporting character who was written to be genuinely awful. It proved something that Hollywood hadn't fully understood before. Audiences didn't need a hero to fall in love with. They needed someone unforgettable. DeVito was unforgettable. It was also on the set of Taxi that DeVito's personal life took its most important turn. He had actually met actress Rhea Perlman years earlier, in January 1971, when she came to see a friend perform in an off-Broadway play DeVito was also in, called The Shrinking Bride. They moved in together within weeks. By the time Taxi was airing, they had already built a life together, and DeVito and Perlman married in a small backyard ceremony on January 28, 1982. Perlman would go on to build her own legendary run playing Carla Tortelli on Cheers, making them one of the rare Hollywood couples where both partners were simultaneously famous for different iconic sitcom roles on different networks. After Taxi ended in 1983, DeVito made the leap from television to film in a way that few TV actors of his era managed successfully. He appeared in Terms of Endearment, which won Best Picture, then Romancing the Stone alongside his old friend Michael Douglas, followed by The Jewel of the Nile, Ruthless People, and Twins opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger, a film built almost entirely on the visual joke of pairing him with one of the biggest action stars in the world. It worked. DeVito wasn't just a character actor anymore. He had become someone audiences would show up to see by name. Behind the camera, he was just as ambitious. In 1987, he made his directorial debut with Throw Mama from the Train, followed by The War of the Roses in 1989 and Hoffa in 1992, working alongside Jack Nicholson on the latter. In 1992, the same year he played the twisted, tragic penguin in Tim Burton's Batman Returns, DeVito and Perlman founded Jersey Films together. It became one of the most influential independent production companies of the 1990s, backing Pulp Fiction, Get Shorty, Gattaca, Erin Brockovich, and Garden State, among others. DeVito received an Academy Award nomination as a producer on Erin Brockovich. He wasn't just acting anymore. He was shaping what got made. In 1996, DeVito directed and starred in Matilda, based on Roald Dahl's novel, casting Perlman as the mother to his cartoonishly awful father figure. It became a beloved family film, one that generations of children grew up on, often without realizing the two actors playing Matilda's negligent parents were married in real life. 3 years later, in 1999, DeVito produced and co-starred in Man on the Moon, a film about his former Taxi co-star Andy Kaufman, who had died of cancer in 1984 at just 35 years old. DeVito had considered Kaufman one of the strangest and most fascinating people he ever worked with, someone who blurred the line between performance and reality so completely that DeVito sometimes genuinely couldn't tell where the act ended. Making a film about him, years after his death, was as much an act of grief and tribute as it was a business decision. By the early 2000s, DeVito had built one of the more unusual resumes in Hollywood. Acclaimed character actor, respected director, powerful independent producer, all while standing at 4 feet 10 inches in an industry that had spent his entire career telling him that shouldn't be possible. In 2006, at 62, DeVito joined the cast of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia as Frank Reynolds, a role that would introduce him to an entirely new, younger generation of fans who knew him more for chaotic couch crawling and unhinged one-liners than for Louis De Palma or the Penguin. The show turned him into a cult icon all over again, decades into a career that had already peaked once. But away from the sets, DeVito's marriage was quietly unraveling. In October 2012, after 30 years of marriage and more than 40 years together, DeVito and Perlman announced they were separating. It shocked fans who had watched them as one of Hollywood's steadiest couples for decades. They reconciled in March 2013, and for a few years it seemed like the split had simply been a rough patch. Then, in March 2017, they separated again, this time for good, after 35 years of marriage. And here's the part that surprises most people. They never actually divorced. Rhea Perlman has said publicly that she has no interest in ever filing the paperwork. There is love between them, a lifetime of it, 3 children, now grandchildren, and neither of them has wanted to formally close that chapter, even while living separately. Perlman has described the arrangement candidly. She has said she genuinely likes having her own space now, being able to watch what she wants without negotiating a television, having the freedom to do things on her own schedule. But she has also admitted, without much sugarcoating, that living alone isn't always what she would choose. She has spoken about sharing her house now mostly with her dog and about the strange, mixed nature of being permanently separated from someone she still loves and still calls her spouse. DeVito, for his part, has said the two of them remain close, that they see each other regularly, that they still show up for family events, birthdays, award shows, red carpets, side by side, still presenting as a unit to the world, even though the marriage as it once existed no longer functions the same way behind closed doors. It is in its own way one of the saddest and most quietly honest parts of DeVito's life story. Not a bitter divorce, not a tabloid scandal, just two people who built an entire life together, raised 3 children, built a production company, made some of the most beloved films of their generation side by side, and who ultimately found they could love each other and still not be able to live in the same house. They chose honesty over performance, separation over pretending, and yet neither could bring themselves to make it legally final. It is love that didn't work as a marriage anymore, and neither of them has been willing to call it anything other than what it actually is. Even after decades of screen success, DeVito kept chasing new challenges rather than coasting on the ones he'd already conquered. In 2012 and 2013, he took on the West End, starring as Willie Clark in a revival of Neil Simon's The Sunshine Boys in London. Then, in 2017, at 72 years old, he made his Broadway debut, playing Gregory Solomon in a revival of Arthur Miller's The Price, a performance that earned him a Tony Award nomination. It was a strange kind of full-circle moment for a man who had started his professional life on tiny off-Broadway stages decades earlier, chasing rent money in small parts, and who returned to the theater as an established legend still hungry enough to want the validation of a live audience one more time. He also became something of an unlikely voice-acting institution, lending his unmistakable rasp to animated and family films across 4 decades, from Hercules to Space Jam to Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, introducing yet another generation of children to his voice long before they'd ever see his face. And in one of the more charming late career turns of his life, DeVito became the first celebrity spokesman for Jersey Mike's Subs in 2022, a sandwich chain he had genuinely eaten at for decades growing up just a few miles from its original New Jersey location. It wasn't a calculated brand deal dreamed up by an agent. It was a guy endorsing a sandwich shop he actually loved. DeVito has also quietly used his platform and money for causes closer to home. In 2023, he donated $500,000 to the hospital in Neptune Township, where he was born, the same building that had once been named Raleigh Fick and Paul Morgan Memorial and is now part of Jersey Shore University Medical Center. It wasn't a press-hungry gesture wrapped in a media tour. It was a quiet nod back to where everything for him had started, decades before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. As DeVito aged, Fairbanks disease didn't get easier to live with. Joint pain and early arthritis are common outcomes of the condition, and DeVito, who spent decades doing physical comedy, stunts, and demanding physical performances, put his body through more than most people his age ever will. He has rarely spoken about the specifics of his day-to-day pain publicly, preferring to let his work speak for itself rather than turning his condition into a headline. But people close to the industry have long known that a man who spent decades sliding across floors, being thrown around sets, and playing larger-than-life physical characters was doing so with a body that was never built for that kind of punishment in the first place. What makes this part of his story sad isn't dramatics or secrecy. It's the quiet discipline of it. DeVito has never leaned on his condition for sympathy, never used it to explain away a bad day on set, never made it part of his public persona the way some celebrities do with health struggles. Reflecting on it in later interviews, he has framed the height itself less as a burden than as simply the shape his life took, something he adjusted to rather than something he fought against emotionally. But adjustment isn't the same as absence of pain, and the physical wear of the condition is well documented independent of how he chooses to talk about it publicly. He simply kept working, kept showing up, kept being funny, while carrying a physical burden that never really goes away and generally only gets heavier with age. Think, too, about what It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia has actually asked of his body for close to 20 years. Frank Reynolds is a character built almost entirely around physical chaos. Crawling out of furniture, throwing himself into absurd stunts, being manhandled, dragged, and thrown around a set well into his 60s and 70s. Most performers his age, with a chronic joint condition, would have quietly asked for a stunt double and a lighter workload. DeVito, by every account, kept doing it himself, year after year, because that's simply who he is. At 80, the man audiences still picture leaping off couches and screaming through absurd sitcom storylines is doing that work with joints that have been fighting him since childhood. DeVito's father died in the early 1970s, during the years when Danny was still struggling to establish himself as an actor, long before Taxi or any real financial security. It came at a moment when DeVito had little to show for years of pursuing acting, and it forced him to reckon, at least briefly, with whether the path he had chosen was worth the sacrifice. He has spoken about how deeply that loss affected him, arriving as it did during one of the hardest, most uncertain stretches of his adult life. He didn't quit, but the timing of it, losing a parent while still fighting for a foothold in an industry that kept rejecting him, is one of the quieter tragedies buried inside his rise to fame. Success, when it eventually came without his father there to see the version of it that mattered most. There is a version of DeVito's story that could be told as pure triumph. The short kid from Jersey who became one of the most beloved actors in America, who built an empire, who helped produce some of the most important films of the last 50 years. All of that is true, but sit with the fuller picture for a moment. A body that has been quietly working against him since birth. One that never stops aching even as he keeps performing physical comedy well into his 8th decade. A marriage built over more than 40 years that he and the woman he loves ultimately couldn't sustain living inside of, even though neither can bring themselves to formally end it. A childhood shaped by feeling different in a body that drew stares and bullying before he ever learned how to turn that difference into a career. A father he lost during the leanest, most uncertain years of his life, before any of the success arrived to make the sacrifice feel worth it. None of it is scandal. None of it is the kind of manufactured drama that fills up gossip channels. It is simply the ordinary, complicated sadness that sits underneath even the most successful lives. Chronic pain nobody sees, a family reshaped by separation instead of divorce, a lifetime spent proving your body wrong. Danny DeVito built a career on being funny, on being loud, on being impossible to ignore. But how he actually lives now, at 80, largely on his own, still close to a wife he never legally lost, still carrying the same body that has ached since he was a boy in Asbury Park, is quieter and more bittersweet than the highlight reel ever lets on. DeVito and Perlman raised 3 children together. Lucy, born in 1983, Grace, born in 1985, and Jacob, known as Jake, born in 1987. All 3 grew up moving between sets and cities as their parents' careers demanded, an upbringing Jake has since described as genuinely enriching rather than disruptive. Grace largely stayed out of the spotlight, pursuing an MFA and building a life around painting and performance art. Jake became a producer and director in his own right, eventually founding a second production company with his father. Lucy followed most directly in her parents' footsteps as a working actor. And in 2023, she and her father shared a Broadway stage together in I Need That, a genuine full-circle moment for a man whose own theater career began in tiny off-Broadway houses decades earlier. The family has continued to expand in the years since DeVito and Perlman's second and final separation. Lucy welcomed her first child in 2024, making Danny a grandfather, and Grace and her husband had a son the year before. DeVito has spoken about how becoming a grandfather has given him and Perlman fresh common ground, new reasons to be in the same room, new photographs to compare, new small joys to share even from separate houses. It's a reminder that even in the parts of his life that didn't work out the way he once expected, the family he and Rhea built together has kept finding ways to stay whole. And yet, he is still here, still working, still showing up on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, alongside a cast he has been part of for nearly 2 decades. Still close with his children, Lucy, Grace, and Jake, all of whom have built their own creative careers, some working directly with him. Still close,